Good evening, friend. Tonight we're turning the clock back when America seemed to be holding its breath. The streets echoed with music. From Carole King on the record player to kids singing along on school buses. Families gathered around color TVs, and a gallon of gas still cost pocket change. But the year wasn't all light and laughter. The Vietnam War weighed heavy. Trust in leaders faltered, and change swept through homes, classrooms, and dinner tables alike. This isn't a glossy postcard of the past, it's a lived-in memory of both beauty and burden. Everyday life, as ordinary as a cup of coffee at the kitchen table, carried the weight of a world in transition. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, you're welcome to like and subscribe. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? It is easy to look back on 1972 and imagine a world frozen in the colors of old photographs. But life then was full of motion, worry, and wonder. People woke up each morning to the sound of alarm clocks that rattled on nightstands, and many families still relied on the daily newspaper for their first glimpse of the wider world. The front page carried the weight of ongoing war overseas, the struggle for trust in politics at home, and the growing voices of younger generations pushing for change. Yet the mornings themselves were ordinary. A percolator hissed on the stove while children tugged on clothes for school, and fathers left for work carrying lunch pails or briefcases. America was shifting. Caught between the traditions of the 50s and 60s and the uncertain future of the 70s, homes were beginning to feel the first stirrings of inflation. Though prices still seemed manageable compared to what would follow later in the decade. The rhythm of daily life remained steady, with families sitting down for meals together, neighbors stopping to chat on sidewalks, and the radio filling kitchens with music. The year was one of contrasts. Steady routines set against a background of cultural upheaval. It was not yet an age of personal computers or instant communication. So people relied on landline telephones, handwritten notes, and face-to-face conversations. Evenings were often spent in front of the television, where trusted anchors told the nation what had happened that day, bringing both comfort and unease. This balance between the ordinary and the uncertain made 1972 both familiar and unsettled, a year where many Americans clung to small daily rituals to steady themselves against the changes rolling in around them. A morning in 1972 often began at the kitchen table, where the daily paper was spread open beside a steaming cup of coffee. The newsprint left faint smudges on fingertips, and the headlines carried a mixture of local stories and global concerns. For many households, this ritual was as steady as the rising sun. Fathers might glance at the sports page while mothers scanned grocery ads, circling sales on canned goods or coffee tins. Children sometimes clipped out pictures or comics before school, folding them into pockets for later. The percolator's steady drip provided a background rhythm, filling the kitchen with the smell of strong coffee that was often softened with cream and sugar. Toast popped up from metal toasters that browned unevenly, and margarine or butter was scraped cold from the refrigerator to spread across its surface. News was not immediate in those days, and so the paper represented the most complete summary of the world, even though the events it reported had already passed by a day. Neighbors might discuss headlines over fences, and older folks at the diner nursed bottomless cups, while trading opinions about politics, weather, or ball games. This sharing of information, though slower, connected people to one another in ways that constant digital alerts never could. The kitchen table was more than a place to eat. It was the heart of the home, where worries, laughter, and the steady hum of life came together. It is easy to forget now how much weight those folded pages carried. But at the time, they guided conversations, shaped decisions, and gave families the sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. The driveway in 1972 often told as much of a story as the living room. Cars were symbols of independence, and they reflected the character of a household. Station wagons with wood grain sides carried families to church, ball games, and grocery stores, while compact Chevrolets or Fords promised teenagers the first taste of freedom once they got their licenses. Pickup trucks were still common in small towns, often rusted around the edges but dependable for hauling tools, lumber, or bales of hay. Gasoline prices were still low enough that few thought much about filling up, and gas stations were places where attendants came out to pump fuel, clean windshields, and check oil levels. Engines rumbled in the early mornings as fathers left for work, and by evening the smell of warm metal hung in the air when the cars pulled back into the drive. Children played around parked cars with jump ropes or chalk, their games marked by the sight of hubcaps glinting in the sun. Car culture stretched into music as well, with AM radios buzzing to life as drivers tuned in to stations that played a mix of rock, soul, and pop. Teenagers cruised through town with windows rolled down, the sound of tires on pavement mixing with the latest songs. The automobile shaped how families lived, determining where they could work, shop, or travel. Trips across state lines for vacations, crowded back seats with siblings elbowing for space, and summer evenings spent washing the car in the driveway were woven into the rhythm of the year. Looking back, the car was more than transportation. It was a marker of identity, a stage for memories, and a constant reminder that America in 1972 still measured much of its freedom in miles traveled on open roads. Music in 1972 poured through every doorway and window, carrying with it the mood of the times. Radios sat on kitchen counters, dashboards, and nightstands, delivering a steady flow of sound that bound families and friends together. The charts were filled with voices that have since become timeless, from the smooth harmonies of the Carpenters to the powerful presence of Aretha Franklin. Elton John was rising quickly, and Al Green's soulful sound echoed from jukeboxes in diners across America. Teenagers huddled in bedrooms, playing 45s on record players, carefully lowering the needle and waiting for the crackle before the music began. Record shops downtown lined their walls with colorful album covers, and the act of saving up a few dollars to buy one felt like a triumph. At school dances, the gymnasium filled with swirling lights and a mix of laughter, nervous glances, and the thump of bass through speakers that sometimes shook the floor. Even at grocery stores, shoppers moved along aisles with tinny music overhead, proving how far sound had reached into every part of daily life. Songs became more than entertainment. They carried hope, frustration, love, and longing. Protest music still echoed from the 60s, but new melodies spoke of tenderness and reflection, showing how America was both weary and searching for comfort. On summer evenings, the sound of radios drifted out of car windows, mixing with the chirp of cicadas and the hum of engines idling at stoplights. Music created a common language that crossed generations, even when parents and children disagreed about volume or lyrics. Looking back, the soundscape of 1972 was rich, layered, and unforgettable, shaping not only what people heard, but also how they remembered their lives. School life in 1972 carried its own blend of excitement and unease. The hallways were filled with the slam of lockers, the shuffle of feet in bell-bottom jeans, and the faint smell of chalk dust clinging to the air. Hair was longer, collars wider, and classrooms buzzed with whispered conversations that carried the worries of the time. Some students kept one eye on the future, wondering about college or work, while others thought about the possibility of being called to serve in the war overseas. Teachers worked to keep lessons steady, moving from blackboards to overhead projectors, while students passed folded notes back and forth when they thought no one was looking. The cafeteria echoed with clattering trays and the chatter of friends, and gymnasiums filled with the sound of basketballs pounding against polished floors. Teenagers lingered at lockers, traded comic books or magazines, and spoke about bands, television shows, and who might ask whom to the next dance. Outside, schoolyards were gathering places where girls jumped rope and boys tossed footballs. But inside the building, there was always a hum of responsibility mixed with restlessness. Clubs, pep rallies, and school plays gave students an outlet, offering the chance to shine in front of friends and neighbors. Yet the times were shifting, and the influence of social change could be felt even within the classroom walls. It was a place where old traditions met new ideas, where teachers who had started their careers in the 50s found themselves facing a generation that spoke differently, dressed differently, and questioned more. Still, at its heart, the school remained a steady anchor, a place where friendships were formed, lessons were learned, and the future was quietly shaped, one day at a time. Money in 1972 carried a different weight than it does today. A single dollar could stretch surprisingly far, buying a gallon of gasoline, a loaf of bread, or even a hamburger at the local diner. Families were careful with how they spent, clipping coupons from the newspaper and saving trading stamps that could later be exchanged for household goods. Children were often given pocket change for candy, bubble gum, or a soda from a vending machine, and those small coins felt like riches in their hands. Paychecks were modest, but many households managed to make ends meet with one parent working outside the home while the other kept the household running. People still paid with cash most of the time, folding worn bills into wallets and jingling coins in their pockets. While checkbooks were carefully balanced at the kitchen table, credit cards were not yet common for everyday use, and debt was something families often worked hard to avoid. Inflation had begun to stir in the background, and prices were creeping higher, though most did not realize how quickly costs would rise in the years to follow. For the moment, a dollar still seemed dependable. Children might save theirs for comic books or baseball cards, while teenagers tucked away earnings from part-time jobs to buy records or help with gas money. In many ways, money was simpler then, more tangible and more closely tied to daily routines. There was a sense that frugality was not just a choice, but a value, passed down from parents who had lived through leaner times. Looking back, the worth of a dollar in 1972 was not only about what it could buy, but about the lessons of responsibility and restraint that came with it. Saturday mornings in 1972 carried a magic that children still talk about today. The week's worries seemed to fall away as kids hurried out of bed, sometimes even before the sun had fully risen, eager to claim the best spot in front of the television. A bowl of cereal was the meal of choice, poured high with milk from a glass bottle or carton, often sweetened with sugar that left the milk at the bottom deliciously flavored. The living room filled with the sounds of animated voices, laughter, and catchy theme songs from the cartoon lineup that stretched for hours. Parents often lingered in the kitchen, grateful for a few quiet minutes with their coffee while the children were glued to the screen. Commercials for toys and breakfast foods were as much a part of the ritual as the shows themselves, planting dreams in young minds of plastic playsets and action figures. The television was still a large piece of furniture, heavy and box-shaped, and families often gathered around it together later in the day, but Saturday mornings belonged to the children. It was the one time they could be certain the programming was made just for them. When the final cartoons ended, often around lunchtime, kids scattered outside to ride bikes, build forts, or play ball, carrying with them the lingering glow of a morning that felt just a little brighter. For many, those hours became the highlight of the week, weaving together the innocence of childhood with the excitement of a culture that understood the simple joy of letting children be children. Sunday in 1972 carried a rhythm that felt steady and familiar across much of the country. Families rose early, children tugged into their best clothes, shoes polished the night before, and hair combed neatly despite protests. Mothers often wore dresses or skirts, Fathers buttoned crisp shirts, and children squirmed as ties or tights were adjusted. Church bells rang out across small towns and city neighborhoods alike, calling people to gather. The sanctuary smelled faintly of polished wood and hymnals, and the sound of the organ set the pace for the morning. Families filled the pews, neighbors nodded in greeting, and whispers of conversation floated until the service began. Sermons often mixed scripture with gentle reminders about family and community, reinforcing values that many already lived by through daily routines. Children shifted impatiently, waiting for the final hymn, while older folks sang every word by heart. Afterward, the fellowship continued outside or in church basements, where coffee percolated and plates of cookies or potluck dishes were set out. It was as much a social occasion as a spiritual one, a chance to catch up on news, check in on those who were ill, and share stories of the week. Sundays often stretched into family dinners at home, sometimes with roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and pies cooling on windowsills. In many places, stores were closed, giving the day a slower, more restful pace that is rare now. Children played outside in their good clothes, careful not to scuff shoes before supper, while parents took time to visit relatives or simply rest. For many Americans, Sunday was less about the sermon itself and more about the sense of belonging, the grounding in tradition, and the reminder that life was richer when shared. Main Street in 1972 was still the heartbeat of many towns. Storefront windows displayed dresses, shoes, radios, and rows of canned goods stacked neatly to catch the eye of passers-by. Five and dime shops bustled with children clutching coins, eager to trade them for candy, stickers, or small toys. At the soda fountain, teenagers perched on stools sipping cherry cokes, talking about music and weekend plans. Barbershops and beauty parlors hummed with gossip, the sound of clippers and hairdryers blending with laughter. Small theaters showed the latest films on hand-painted marquees, and families walked together in the evening to catch a double feature. The sidewalks filled with neighbors who paused to chat, carrying brown paper grocery bags or simply enjoying the warm air of summer. Local hardware stores still thrived, with clerks who knew their customers by name and could recite prices without looking at a list. For children, a nickel could buy a jawbreaker that lasted the whole afternoon. And for parents, a trip downtown often meant a chance to run into friends, exchange news, or pick up the week's necessities. Though shopping malls were beginning to grow in some areas, the local Main Street remained a place where people felt connected. Each building had a story, each shopkeeper a familiar face, and the rhythm of life was marked not by how fast you could get what you needed, but by the moments you spent with others along the way. Looking back, it was less about what you bought and more about the sense of belonging, a reminder that in 1972, community was still measured in conversations shared across counters and sidewalks rather than transactions made quickly and alone. The telephone in 1972 was a fixture in every household, usually mounted on the kitchen wall or resting heavily on a side table. Its rotary dial clicked loudly as fingers spun across the numbered circle, and children often misdialed, starting over with a sigh. Long cords stretched across rooms, giving teenagers just enough distance to whisper from the hallway while parents pretended not to listen. Sharing a phone line was still common in smaller towns, and sometimes a neighbor's voice would break in, asking politely if they might have the line back soon. Calls were often short, made to confirm dinner plans or ask a quick question, since charges for long-distance calls added up quickly. For young people, however, the phone was a lifeline. They lingered on calls with friends, twisting the cord absent-mindedly, hoping the conversation would never end. Many remember the quiet thrill of waiting by the phone for someone special to call, the anticipation almost heavier than the conversation itself. Parents used the phone for practical matters, ringing the school, the repair shop, or the doctor's office. And the sound of the bell echoing through the house often brought everyone running to see who it might be. Unlike today, missing a call meant waiting until later, because messages were taken by hand on scraps of paper and left beside the receiver. The phone was both ordinary and full of possibility, tying homes to the outside world in ways that felt new and essential. In 1972, the act of dialing, waiting through the clicks, and hearing a familiar voice on the other end carried a sense of presence that is easy to overlook now. Evenings in 1972 often settled around the glow of the television, and for many households, the familiar voice of Walter Cronkite was the most trusted sound of the day. Families gathered after supper, children sprawled on the floor while parents sat back in easy chairs, listening as the day's events were delivered in a calm and steady tone. The news carried stories of the war still raging overseas, shifts in politics, and changes sweeping through culture at home. It was not entertainment, but it was treated with seriousness, as if the entire country leaned in together to hear the same report. The broadcast did not race or flash across the screen. Instead, images were shown carefully and words were measured. Commercials broke up the heaviness, advertising everything from laundry soap to new cars, often with cheerful jingles that felt almost out of place beside grim updates. After the news ended, families often turned to sitcoms or dramas, allowing laughter or suspense to soften the weight of what had just been shared. Still, the voice of the anchor lingered in the back of the mind, carrying a sense of authority and trust that gave the news a special place in the home. For children, the reports might have been confusing or dull, but the presence of parents watching so intently left an impression that the world beyond the living room was serious and uncertain. Looking back, television news in 1972 did more than inform. It offered a common experience, a shared window into the wider world, and a reminder that in every household across America, people were hearing the same words at the same time, each quietly wondering what might come next. The dinner table in 1972 was still the center of family life. Supper was rarely a quick affair and almost always eaten together, with everyone called in from the yard or living room when it was ready. The meals themselves were hearty but simple, stretching ingredients to feed everyone without waste. Meatloaf with mashed potatoes, pot roast with carrots, fried chicken, or casseroles made from cans of soup were common sights. Milk was poured into glass tumblers, and bread sat in a basket beside sticks of butter, softened just enough to spread. Parents asked about school, while children spoke in turns, sometimes reluctantly, about their day. Jokes and small arguments spilled across the table, but the ritual of sitting down together remained steady. Television was switched off, at least until the meal was done, and phones were ignored, their rings cutting briefly into the background. Dishes were passed hand to hand, and often seconds were offered before plates were cleared. Dessert might be as simple as pudding, Jell-O, or a pie cooling on the counter. The rhythm of dinner gave shape to the day, marking the point where work ended and home reclaimed its space. In many houses, prayers of thanks were spoken before eating, while in others, the ritual was simply the gathering itself. For children, it was a time to listen to the cadence of adult voices, absorbing lessons about patience, gratitude, and responsibility without realizing it. For parents, it was one of the few moments of pause, a chance to see their family all together. Looking back, the family dinner of 1972 carried more than food. It carried the quiet assurance that no matter what the world beyond the door might hold, there was always this place of return. Backyards and ball fields in 1972 were the true playgrounds for children. Baseball was still the game most often played. Whether it was an organized little league match with uniforms and cheering parents, or a pickup game on a dusty lot marked only by chalked bases and dented bats. Transistor radios carried the voices of famous announcers, their words echoing from porches or car windows as neighbors listened to professional games being called inning by inning. Even those who didn't play could follow along, hearing every strike and hit while mowing the lawn or sitting in lawn chairs. In the evenings, kids invented their own games when the heat of the day faded. Hide-and-seek wound through backyards, shouts and laughter bouncing between fences. Tag turned sidewalks into racetracks, and hopscotch squares chalked onto the pavement wore down with every footstep. Parents often watched from porches, a glass of iced tea in hand, or leaned on fences, chatting with neighbors while keeping an ear out for their children. The rule was often simple: be home by the time the streetlights flickered on. Until then, freedom belonged to the children, who carried bruised knees, scraped elbows, and the kind of joy that came from hours spent outside without distraction. Summer nights ended with kids panting, sweaty and tired, only to rise the next day, ready to do it all again. The games themselves may have been simple, but the memories they built were anything but. Baseballs lost in tall grass, fireflies caught in jars, and the sound of a radio calling a close game are stitched into the fabric of what it meant to be young in 1972. Drive-in theaters in 1972 were still a cherished part of American life, blending the excitement of the movies with the comfort of being in your own car. Families loaded children into the back seats with blankets, lawn chairs, and coolers full of soda and sandwiches. Teenagers often went in groups, piling into cars and hoping the attendant wouldn't notice how many were squeezed inside. Once parked, the small metal speaker was hooked onto the car window, crackling with sound that carried the dialogue of the film into the night air. The giant screen glowed against the dark sky, and the smell of popcorn drifted from the concession stand, where lines of people formed under bright neon lights. Mosquito coils burned on dashboards to keep bugs away, while children leaned forward with wide eyes, watching cartoons that usually played before the feature. Couples often treated it as a date, sharing popcorn and holding hands in the front seat, while younger kids in pajamas eventually fell asleep before the movie ended. Drive-ins were more than just about films. They were a social gathering. You could wave to neighbors parked a few spaces over, or run into classmates at the snack counter. Some nights, 2 or even 3 films were shown back to back, and cars lingered until late, headlights flicking on as families slowly pulled away. The experience was communal and personal at the same time, both a night out and a night at home on wheels. Looking back, it was less about the movie itself and more about the feeling of being part of something larger, a field of cars facing the same glowing screen, sharing laughter, gasps, and silence together under the open sky. Fashion in 1972 reflected the spirit of a country caught between tradition and bold experimentation. Teenagers crowded into clothing shops searching for bell-bottom jeans, tie-dye shirts, and maxi dresses that swayed with every step. Polyester began to dominate wardrobes, loved for its easy wash and bright colors. Though it was not always as comfortable as it looked, young men grew their hair longer, often paired with wide-collared shirts and patterned jackets, while women experimented with miniskirts, peasant blouses, and chunky platform shoes. Department stores displayed mannequins dressed in styles that seemed daring to older generations but thrilling to the young. At school dances, gymnasiums glowed with swirling lights reflecting off shimmering fabrics. And in small towns, back-to-school shopping trips became annual rituals where mothers and daughters pored over racks of dresses, deciding what was practical versus what was fashionable. Hairstyles were as much a statement as the clothing. Feathered hair was beginning to gain popularity, while curlers and home perms were still common in family bathrooms. In beauty parlors, women sat beneath large dryers flipping through magazines, pointing at styles that promised a more modern look. Even small details, such as colorful scarves, peace symbol jewelry, or wide belts, spoke volumes about identity. Fashion was not just fabric, it was a way of declaring who you were, whether rebellious, traditional, or somewhere in between. For many, these clothes symbolized a break from the conservative styles of the past, carrying with them the energy of music, art, and cultural change. Looking back, the bold colors, wide collars, and flowing fabrics of 1972 remind us that style was never just about keeping up with trends. It was about capturing a moment in time and wearing it proudly. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what's hidden. For many teenagers in 1972, nothing felt more grown-up than receiving that very first paycheck. Summer jobs were often simple but steady, the kind that taught responsibility and built character. Some bagged groceries at the corner store, carefully placing bread and eggs at the top of the paper bags, while learning the rhythm of friendly small talk with customers. Others mowed lawns in the hot sun, pushing heavy mowers across yards for just a few dollars each. Ice cream shops, diners, and drive-ins provided work too, with young employees scooping cones, wiping counters, or balancing trays at crowded tables. At the end of the week, the envelope handed over by the manager carried more pride than paper. Inside, the crisp bills and neatly printed pay stub gave teenagers a sense of independence. Even if the amount was modest, many tucked part of their earnings away for gas money, records, or a new outfit, while parents often encouraged saving a portion in a passbook account at the local bank. Holding that first paycheck was more than financial. It was emotional, a marker of stepping into adulthood. The work itself could be tiring and sometimes monotonous, but the feeling of being trusted, of earning something through effort, stayed long after the hours were forgotten. Friends compared wages, shared complaints about strict bosses, or laughed about mistakes made during their shifts. Yet underneath the chatter was pride. That first paycheck represented not just money, but proof that they were capable of contributing, standing a little taller in the world. Looking back, those small jobs laid foundations of discipline and confidence that would carry into later life, making the memory of that first envelope one worth keeping. Learning to cook in 1972 was less about following recipes from glossy books and more about watching and imitating what mothers and grandmothers had done for years. Kitchens were classrooms where lessons began with peeling potatoes, snapping beans, or stirring batter until the arm ached. Mothers handed down not just instructions but also habits of thrift, showing how to stretch leftovers into casseroles or soups that could feed the family twice. Fried chicken crackled in cast-iron skillets, pies were rolled out on flour-dusted counters, and the oven often carried the comforting smell of bread or cake baking in the late afternoon. Girls were usually expected to pick up these skills early, though many boys learned too, especially when they showed an interest or needed to help out. Mistakes were part of the process. Cakes that fell flat, soups too salty, or bread with crusts too hard. Yet the lessons stuck because they were tied to routine. The kitchen in 1972 was rarely silent. Radios played softly in the background, mothers hummed while they worked, and children asked questions or told stories while standing on stools to reach the counter. Cookbooks and recipe cards were consulted, but much of the knowledge was memorized, passed from one generation to the next without ever being written down. By the time young people left home, they carried with them the skills to prepare meals that not only filled the belly, but also carried the taste of memory. Learning to cook from Mama was not just about food. It was about family, survival, and pride. It reminded children that caring for others began with something as simple as a warm plate on the table. The gas station in 1972 was more than just a place to fill up the tank. It was often a gathering spot where young men leaned against cars, sipping sodas from glass bottles, and talking about music, engines, or weekend plans. Attendants still came out to pump gas, wash windshields, and check oil levels, creating a sense of service that made every customer feel looked after. Neon signs glowed as the evening settled in, casting a red and blue hue across the pavement, and the smell of gasoline and rubber hung in the warm air. Teenagers with newly minted driver's licenses often treated the gas station as a hub, circling through on Friday nights just to see who else might be there. Conversations drifted from casual jokes to serious talk about the future, and the hum of engines idling filled the background. Inside, small convenience counters sold candy, gum, and packs of gum or chips, items often bought with change jingling in pockets. Local gossip traveled fast through these stops, passed from one driver to the next before making its way back home. For mechanics working in the attached garages, the station was also a place of steady labor, with the sound of tools striking metal and tires hissing with air. The gas station embodied both motion and pause. It was where journeys began and ended, and where friendships found space to linger under buzzing lights long after the cars were parked. Looking back, it is easy to see why so many memories were made in these places. They were not just stations of fuel, but of connection, a backdrop to the restless energy of a generation that measured time in conversations held leaning against warm hoods under the open sky. Snow days in 1972 carried a kind of magic that children still recall with clarity. The news of school closings usually came over the crackling voice of the local radio station, read slowly from a list that had everyone holding their breath until their school's name was announced. When it was, cheers erupted in kitchens and living rooms, and the day instantly transformed from routine to adventure. Boots were pulled on, coats zipped tight, scarves wrapped high, and mittens tugged snugly over hands. Sleds made of wood and metal runners were dragged through snowy streets to the steepest hill in town, and children raced down with laughter that echoed against the cold air. The sound of shovels scraping driveways mixed with the squeals of snowball fights and the thud of snowmen being built. Parents often joined in the work of clearing paths, while keeping one eye on children darting through drifts. Inside, windows fogged with warmth, as kitchens filled with the smell of cocoa made from powder and milk, or soup simmering on the stove. Socks and mittens steamed dry over radiators, leaving the room filled with the scent of wet wool. Though power sometimes flickered during big storms, families leaned on candles, board games, and storytelling to pass the time. The day was not wasted, it was treasured. Snow days offered not only freedom from schoolwork, but also a pause from ordinary schedules. They were gifts of time, where the whole neighborhood seemed to be outside together, slipping, sliding, and laughing, as if winter itself had decided to give them a holiday. Looking back, snow days were less about the weather and more about the memory of joy, togetherness, and warmth created in the heart of winter. School lunches in 1972 had a character all their own, remembered as much for their simplicity as for their taste. Cafeterias were filled with the clatter of metal trays sliding along rails, each one lined with compartments ready to hold the day's offerings. Milk came in small cardboard cartons, often cold enough to leave fingers chilled, and sometimes a bit tricky to open without spilling. The menu rotated through dependable staples: meatloaf with gravy, peanut butter, sandwiches, squares of pizza that were more bread than cheese, and vegetables often boiled until soft. On special days, dessert appeared in the form of pudding, a cookie, or a slice of sheet cake cut into perfect squares. Children traded items across tables, swapping fruit cups for extra rolls or saving up the nerve to ask a friend for their untouched brownie. The air carried a mix of smells, yeast rolls, steamed vegetables, and cleaning soap that never quite disappeared from the tables. Conversation filled the room, with laughter rising above the constant scrape of chairs against the floor. For many, school lunch was more than food. It was a chance to gather, share stories, and feel part of the larger group. Some students brought lunches from home in metal boxes, decorated with television characters or bands, their sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and apples rolling loose inside. These were carefully packed by mothers in the morning, and opening them was like unwrapping a small piece of home in the middle of the day. Though the food itself might not have been remarkable, the ritual of lunchtime, the friendships made at long tables, and the comfort of a break from lessons gave it a special place in memory. Magazines in 1972 carried a particular power, especially for teenagers searching for style, music, and inspiration. Young girls eagerly flipped through the pages of 17, studying fashion spreads that showcased the latest skirts, blouses, and hairstyles. The glossy images of smiling models leaning against lockers or standing on city streets felt both distant and attainable, offering a glimpse into a world that promised freedom and maturity. At the same time, Tiger Beat and similar publications captured the hearts of music fans, plastered with faces of pop idols like David Cassidy and Donny Osmond. Posters torn from the center pages often ended up taped to bedroom walls, a collage of bright smiles and styled hair that became silent companions through long afternoons. The cost of these magazines was low enough that many teens could buy them with babysitting money or coins saved from allowance, and the act of purchasing one felt like claiming a piece of belonging in a larger cultural conversation. Boys leaned more toward magazines about sports, cars, or comic books, each one carrying its own universe of fascination. In small towns, magazine racks in drugstores or supermarkets became gathering points where kids leafed through the latest issues, dreaming about lives that seemed just beyond reach. For parents, these magazines sometimes sparked concern about vanity or distraction, but most understood them as harmless expressions of youth. Looking back, those slim collections of glossy pages were more than paper. They were windows into an imagined future, tokens of identity, and sparks of conversation that helped shape how young people saw themselves in a world that seemed to be changing almost every day. Long summer evenings in 1972 carried a rhythm that seemed to stretch endlessly, marked by the hum of cicadas and the glow of porch lights turning on one by one down the street. Children darted across lawns barefoot, chasing fireflies with jars poked full of holes, their laughter echoing against the warm air. Neighbors sat outside in lawn chairs, glasses of iced tea sweating in their hands, sharing stories, while the smell of charcoal grills drifted across backyards. Radios played softly through open windows, carrying songs that blended with the chorus of crickets and the low rumble of passing cars. Teenagers leaned against fences or sprawled on driveways, talking about dreams, music, and who might show up at the roller rink that weekend. Parents finished the last chores of the day, watering gardens or hanging laundry that would dry in the night air. There was no rush to close the evening, no pressing need to turn indoors, because time seemed to move more gently under the fading light. Street games of kick the can or hide and seek stretched until someone's mother called from a doorway, her voice carrying easily through the quiet. Even then, children begged for just a few more minutes before reluctantly heading inside. The air grew cooler, the stars sharpened against the dark sky, and the final sounds of the night screen, doors closing, dogs barking faintly in the distance, signaled the close of another summer day. Looking back, those evenings felt almost timeless. Simple gatherings of neighbors and families that stitched communities together in ways both fragile and enduring. Roller rinks in 1972 were alive with energy, music, and the shimmer of mirrored disco balls casting light across polished wooden floors. On Friday and Saturday nights, teenagers crowded the entrance, paying a few dollars to rent skates that often wobbled until they found their balance. The air inside was filled with the smell of popcorn, the sound of laughter, and the steady thump of music pouring from speakers overhead. Popular songs of the day carried skaters in circles, some gliding gracefully, others clinging to the railings while friends encouraged them to let go. Couples held hands as they moved slowly together, while groups of friends sped around in packs, weaving in and out of the crowd. The flashing colored lights gave the rink an almost dreamlike atmosphere, making every turn feel like a small performance. Parents sometimes watched from benches along the wall, chatting quietly while keeping an eye on younger children who were just learning. Breaks between songs were filled with the screech of skates stopping suddenly and the rush to concession stands for sodas or candy. Special moments came when the announcer called for a couple's skate and the floor cleared for pairs moving gently to slower songs, creating memories that lingered for years. Roller rinks were more than recreation. They were places of belonging, where friendships deepened, romances began, and young people felt free in a world that often seemed uncertain outside those doors. Looking back, the glow of the rink lights, the rhythm of wheels on wood, and the thrill of skating in step with music captured the spirit of youth in 1972 like few other places could. The thrill of a first concert in 1972 was unlike anything else. A mixture of nervous anticipation and pure exhilaration. For many teenagers, saving up money from odd jobs or allowances just to afford a ticket was part of the adventure. Concert halls, school gyms, or county fairgrounds became the stage for unforgettable nights, when the music that usually came from radios or records suddenly came alive right in front of them. Crowds gathered early, lines stretching down sidewalks, the hum of conversation blending with the smell of popcorn, cigarettes, and cologne. When the lights finally dimmed, a roar erupted that seemed to shake the walls, followed by the first chords that everyone instantly recognized. The sound was louder than expected, vibrating through the chest, and the sight of the performers felt larger than life. Friends shouted lyrics together, their voices hoarse by the end of the night, while others simply stood in awe, watching every movement on stage. Flashbulbs from cameras sparked occasionally, capturing moments that would end up taped into scrapbooks or photo albums. Even after the last encore faded and the crowd spilled into the night, the feeling lingered. Walking back to cars or buses, ears still ringing, the conversation replayed every song, every detail, as if the experience needed to be preserved before it slipped away. For those who went, a first concert was not just about hearing music live. It was about being part of something bigger, a sea of voices joined together in one unforgettable night. Looking back, those moments carried a magic that no record player could match, forever marking the time when music shifted from sound in a room to memory in the soul. Young love in 1972 often began in the most ordinary places, yet it carried a sense of excitement that made every detail unforgettable. High school dances were common starting points, gymnasiums decorated with crepe paper and balloons, while a record player or live band filled the room with music. Nervous teenagers stood along the edges until someone finally crossed the floor to ask for a dance. And in that moment, the shuffle of shoes and the thump of the bass felt like the whole world had shifted. Notes passed in class, folded tightly, and slipped discreetly from one hand to another, carried words of affection written in hurried handwriting. Walks home after football games, or evenings spent lingering outside under porch lights, gave couples the privacy of shadows and the quiet comfort of shared laughter. Dates were simple, often to the local drive-in, the soda shop, or just a ride around town with the windows rolled down and the radio playing softly. There were no cell phones, so waiting for a call on the family's rotary phone brought both excitement and nerves. Parents kept a watchful eye, reminding young couples of curfews, but the emotions felt no less intense. Rings exchanged as tokens of affection, or photographs tucked into wallets, became symbols of promises whispered under starlit skies. For many, these first romances were fleeting, ending with the change of seasons or the pull of future plans, but they were no less meaningful. Looking back, those tender beginnings of love in 1972 captured not only the sweetness of youth but also the universal feeling of discovering connection for the very first time. Let that one sink in. When you're ready for the next mystery hit, subscribe. In many homes during 1972, the sewing machine was as essential as the stove. Mothers and grandmothers often kept it in the dining room or tucked into a corner of the living space, ready to hum to life whenever a hem needed mending or a new dress needed stitching. Patterns were spread out across kitchen tables, pinned carefully onto fabric that had been bought with coupons or saved from older garments. The steady whir of the needle moving up and down became a familiar background sound, blending with the radio or the voices of children playing nearby. Clothes were patched instead of thrown away, with knees of jeans reinforced by square patches and shirts lengthened with added seams. Dresses for school dances or church were sometimes handmade, each stitch carrying both frugality and love. Young girls often learned by sitting beside their mothers, threading needles, and practicing on scraps of cloth before daring to try a real project. Mistakes were common, with tangled bobbins or seams stitched crooked, but patience was part of the process. The sewing machine also represented creativity. With the right fabric, someone could transform a plain pattern into a garment that looked unique, often brighter or more stylish than anything bought in a store. Many homes kept jars of buttons collected over the years, and drawers filled with spools of thread in every color. It was not just about saving money, it was about self-reliance, the satisfaction of knowing that with time and skill, you could provide for your family in a very tangible way. Looking back, the sewing machine of 1972 was more than a household tool. It was a symbol of resourcefulness, memory, and care stitched into every piece of fabric. Television commercials in 1972 were often as memorable as the shows themselves, filled with catchy jingles and colorful characters that stayed in the mind long after the screen went dark. Children could sing along to cereal ads word for word, their voices echoing in kitchens as they begged their parents to buy the brightly colored boxes on the next grocery trip. Soda brands competed with upbeat songs and smiling faces, while household products were shown in spotless kitchens where everything seemed simpler with the right spray or detergent. Cars were advertised with sweeping shots of highways and confident narrators promising reliability and style, while fast food chains were beginning to expand their reach with jingles that children repeated on playgrounds. The jingles were short but powerful, designed to lodge themselves into memory, and they often did just that. Parents sometimes chuckled at how easily their children memorized the lines of a commercial, yet struggled to remember school lessons. In living rooms across America, the commercials broke up the heaviness of nightly news broadcasts and gave families something lighthearted to hum along to together. They were not just background noise but part of the shared cultural fabric, weaving phrases and songs into everyday conversations. Looking back, many of those jingles and slogans have endured in memory even more vividly than the products themselves. Proof of how deeply advertising tapped into the rhythms of daily life. For families in 1972, commercials brought a mixture of humor, annoyance, and sometimes even genuine delight, marking the moments between programs with a chorus of voices that became the soundtrack of an era. Evenings at home in 1972 often found families gathered around the kitchen table with a board game spread out between them. The clatter of dice on wood, the shuffle of colorful cards, and the laughter that followed made these nights memorable. Monopoly was a favorite, with players haggling over properties and holding their breath as they passed by boardwalk. Parcheesi, Sorry, and Life each had their own following, with rules that sparked both friendly rivalry and occasional squabbles. Children often played more simply, bending the rules when it suited them, while parents smiled and let the game unfold. The table itself carried the wear of meals and homework, but on game nights it became a stage for imagination and competition. Snacks sat within reach, bowls of popcorn or plates of cookies disappearing between turns. For many families, these games were not about winning, but about the togetherness they created. In a world without endless television channels or digital distractions, games offered a way to slow down, to focus on the moment, and to share space. Sometimes neighbors or cousins joined in, and the laughter of a crowded kitchen stretched late into the night. Children remember the thrill of rolling doubles or drawing just the right card, while parents often recall the sound of their family united in fun. Looking back, board games in 1972 were not only a pastime but also a reminder that the simplest moments, spent across a shared table, often became the ones most deeply treasured. Independence Day in 1972 carried a sense of tradition that blended community, celebration, and the height of summer. Parades wound through small-town streets, with children waving flags as marching bands played bright, brassy tunes that echoed against storefronts. Fire trucks rolled slowly along the route, their sirens sounding proudly, while veterans marched in uniform to steady applause from neighbors lining the sidewalks. Families set up folding chairs early in the morning to secure a good view, and vendors sold lemonade, popcorn, and small flags that fluttered in the hot breeze. After the parades ended, parks filled with picnics as families spread blankets under trees, sharing fried chicken, potato salad, and slices of watermelon that dripped sweet juice down children's arms. Games of horseshoes, softball, and sack races entertained both young and old until the evening shadows grew long. As night settled in, crowds gathered again, this time for fireworks that painted the sky in bursts of color and thunder. Parents held small children close as they pointed upward, eyes wide at the sparkling trails that shimmered above. Teenagers watched from car hoods or blankets laid across grassy fields, their laughter mingling with the crack of fireworks in the night air. The 4th of July in 1972 was more than just a holiday. It was a reminder of togetherness, of neighborhoods and families joining in celebration despite the challenges of the era. The day carried both noise and stillness, from the drums of the parade to the quiet awe that followed each fireworks bloom, weaving memory and tradition into the heart of summer. Payphones in 1972 stood like sentinels on street corners, in gas stations, and outside grocery stores, each one a small lifeline to connection beyond the home. The heavy metal booths, often with scratched glass panels, carried the faint smell of cigarettes and gum left behind by previous callers. Dropping a dime into the slot brought the satisfying clink that signaled the line was ready, and fingers spun quickly across the rotary dial before the first ring reached the ear. For teenagers, the payphone was a tool of freedom, a way to call friends from the roller rink or check in with parents before curfew. For travelers, it was a necessity, allowing them to call ahead from bus stations or rest stops, letting loved ones know when they would arrive. Long-distance calls were still expensive, so time was measured carefully. Voices often hurried to fit into the minutes allowed. Waiting for a booth to free up could be its own small test of patience. With lines forming in busier parts of town, each person stepping in and closing the door behind them as if entering a private world. Payphones were also a common backdrop in emergencies, where the sudden scramble for change turned moments of panic into quick prayers that the line would connect. Many people carried small pouches of coins in purses or glove compartments for this very reason. Looking back, payphones in 1972 were were far more than simple machines. They were bridges across distance, offering connection in times of joy, urgency, or ordinary routine. And their presence on nearly every corner made the world feel both larger and smaller all at once. Grocery shopping in 1972 was a weekly ritual that blended necessity with a certain sense of community. Stores were smaller than the sprawling supermarkets that came later, yet they carried everything a family needed, neatly arranged in aisles that smelled of fresh produce, ground coffee, and paper goods. Mothers often steered metal carts down the rows with children trailing behind, sneaking boxes of cereal or candy bars into the basket when they thought no one was looking. Paper bags were the standard, their brown sides folding neatly against one another as clerks packed groceries with practiced speed. Many stores offered green stamps with purchases, and families carefully saved them in booklets that could later be redeemed for housewares or toys. Glass bottles of soda clinked together as they were returned for deposit, carried back in wooden crates to be washed and reused. Prices were low enough that shoppers still compared carefully, clipping coupons from the newspaper and keeping a watchful eye on sales. The checkout line carried its own temptations, with magazines, gum, and candy displayed within reach of small hands. Clerks often knew their customers by name, greeting them with friendly conversation that made the store feel less like a business and more like a gathering place. For children, the highlight might be the promise of a cookie from the bakery section, or a small toy purchased with saved allowance. For parents, it was the satisfaction of leaving with bags filled for the week, each item chosen with care to stretch across meals. Looking back, grocery shopping in 1972 was more than errands and lists. It was a snapshot of daily life, marked by routine, thrift, and the comfort of familiarity. Records in 1972 held a place of honor in many homes, stacked neatly beside turntables or tucked into shelves that proudly displayed colorful album covers. The act of playing a record was almost ceremonial. Sliding the vinyl from its paper sleeve, brushing away invisible dust, and lowering the needle with careful hands created a sense of anticipation. The crackle before the first notes filled the room was as much a part of the experience as the music itself. Albums were listened to in full. Side 1, then side 2, because skipping around was not an option. And this gave songs a flow that felt deliberate, almost like chapters in a story. Teenagers often saved part of their paychecks for weeks just to buy a single record, bringing it home with pride and playing it again and again until every lyric was memorized. Record stores were gathering places where friends compared collections, debated favorite bands, and stood for hours flipping through bins searching for hidden gems. At home, records became the backdrop of daily life, spinning while dinner cooked, homework was done, or neighbors came over for coffee. Portable players allowed music to move from room to room, filling basements, porches, and bedrooms with sound that belonged uniquely to the listener. For many, the covers themselves were part of the memory, with bold art and lyrics printed on the sleeves that encouraged long study while the music played. Looking back, records in 1972 were not simply about entertainment. They were about patience, appreciation, and the joy of letting music shape the mood of an evening, a gathering, or a quiet moment alone. Friday nights in 1972 often revolved around pep rallies and high school football games, events that brought whole towns together. Gymnasiums echoed with the sound of brass bands, the sharp beat of drums setting a rhythm as cheerleaders in wool uniforms led chants that the crowd knew by heart. Students painted signs with slogans to fire up their team, and halls buzzed all week with excitement leading to the game. When the evening came, the stadium lights flickered on, casting a glow across fields that seemed larger than life. Families filled wooden bleachers, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill, sipping from thermoses of hot chocolate or coffee. The smell of popcorn and grilled hot dogs drifted through the stands, mingling with the crisp night air. On the field, the clash of helmets and the cheers of the crowd carried far beyond the school grounds, a soundscape that neighbors could hear from porches blocks away. For teenagers, the game was as much about socializing as it was about the sport, walking the track with friends, huddling in groups, or stealing a quiet moment under the bleachers. Younger children ran along the sidelines imitating the players, while parents and grandparents swapped stories as they cheered. Victories were celebrated with parades of car horns blaring through town afterward, while losses were softened by the simple comfort of being together. Pep rallies and football games weren't only about school pride. They were community rituals, places where everyone, young and old, found a role to play. Looking back, those Friday nights were less about the score and more about the feeling of unity, of belonging to something bigger than oneself, stitched together beneath the bright stadium lights. Snowball fights in 1972 were rarely planned, but they erupted the moment the first good snowfall packed firmly enough to throw. Children spilled into yards and streets, their boots crunching through fresh drifts as they bent to scoop up handfuls of snow. Some built forts, stacking blocks of snow into uneven walls that became shields, while others charged without cover, laughing as icy projectiles whizzed past. Hats slipped down over eyes, mittens stiffened from the cold, and scarves grew damp as the game escalated. It was not unusual for one ambitious throw to accidentally find its way into the collar of a coat, causing squeals of protest that quickly turned into more laughter. Older siblings often took command, strategizing teams, while younger ones tried to keep up, their cheeks red and noses running. Parents sometimes stepped outside, shovels in hand, shaking their heads at the ruckus, but smiling all the same. The battles often ended not with a truce, but with exhaustion, when wet clothes and numb fingers forced everyone back indoors. Kitchens became warm refuges, where hot cocoa steamed in mugs, mittens were laid across radiators, and the stories of the battle were retold with exaggeration. In many families, these skirmishes became winter traditions, eagerly awaited each year when the first heavy snow fell. Even bruised shins or a stinging cheek could not dampen the joy of the memory. Looking back, snowball fights were less about competition and more about release moments of pure childhood freedom, when the cold air rang with laughter and the world felt bright and untroubled beneath its blanket of white. Beauty parlors and barbershops in 1972 were more than places to tidy up one's appearance. They were social hubs where news, gossip, and laughter traveled as quickly as the snip of scissors. Women gathered in salons lined with rows of hooded hair dryers, their curlers wrapped tight, flipping through glossy magazines while waiting for perms to set. The smell of hairspray and permanent solution lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of brewed coffee often served in small paper cups. Hairstyles ranged from bouffants still hanging on from the 60s to newer layered looks that hinted at changing trends. Conversations flowed freely, touching on local happenings, television shows, and family updates, as stylists worked with practiced ease. Barbershops carried their own rhythm, with men sitting in cracked leather chairs reading newspapers while waiting for trims. The buzz of clippers and the slap of brushes against necks punctuated the steady talk of sports, weather, and politics. Boys squirmed in their chairs during haircuts, bribed with lollipops at the end for sitting still, while older men often lingered after their cuts, reluctant to leave the camaraderie of the shop. Prices were low enough that trips were frequent, and many families scheduled regular visits, treating them as part of the routine. Looking back, these spaces were less about style than about connection. They were places where people felt known, where the repetition of familiar voices and steady hands created trust, and where a simple haircut or set could restore more than just appearance. It restored a sense of belonging. A pause is good. But the secrets don't stop here. Subscribe and stay close. Paper routes in 1972 were often a child's first real job, teaching discipline long before adulthood. Boys and girls alike woke before sunrise, pulling on jackets against the chill, and setting out with canvas bags slung across their shoulders. The weight of the newspapers grew heavier with each block. But there was pride in being trusted with the responsibility. Some rode bicycles, carefully balancing stacks of papers on handlebars, while others walked their routes, boots crunching against gravel driveways. Dogs barked as they passed, porch lights flicked on, and the quiet of dawn was broken only by the thud of a paper landing on a step. Rain and snow didn't cancel deliveries. They simply made the job harder, with papers wrapped in rubber bands or slid into plastic sleeves to keep them dry. On weekends, collections had to be made, a task that required knocking on doors and politely asking adults for payment. For many children, this was the first experience handling money, learning to make change, and keeping records in small notebooks. The pay was modest, but it was steady, and the coins jingling in their pockets felt like hard-earned treasure. Parents encouraged the effort, proud of the independence it taught, and neighbors admired the reliability of the young carriers. The work was not glamorous, but it built resilience and routine. Looking back, paper routes were less about the newspapers themselves and more about the lessons stitched into those early mornings, the discipline of rising early, the courage to face weather and strangers, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the day's news reached every doorstep because of your effort. The kitchen radio in 1972 was more than background noise. It was the steady pulse of the household. Perched on a counter or tucked near the window, its dials were worn smooth from daily use. Morning farm reports told families the price of crops and livestock, while weather forecasts prepared children for coats, boots, or umbrellas before heading out the door. Music drifted easily into the air, carrying voices of singers whose records also spun in living rooms across the country. Mothers often tuned in while cooking or ironing, the chatter of the announcer keeping them company through long afternoons. The radio also delivered news with a calm authority, the kind that could make listeners pause in the middle of chopping vegetables just to hear an update from far away. Children remembered jingles that seemed to play endlessly between programs, catchy enough to repeat without thinking. For many families, the radio was always on, low enough not to drown out conversation, but loud enough to weave itself into memory. On Sundays, it carried sermons or gospel music, reminding listeners of their faith, while on weekdays it offered the comfort of routine. Unlike television, the radio left room for imagination, painting pictures in the mind with only words and tone. Looking back, the kitchen radio was not simply an appliance. It was a companion that filled silences, shared news, carried music, and linked households across the country in a common rhythm of sound. Its hum was steady, familiar, and deeply tied to the ordinary heartbeat of life in 1972. Halloween in 1972 was a night of excitement and imagination. When the crisp autumn air carried the smell of fallen leaves and the glow of porch lights signaled treats waiting behind each door. Costumes were often store-bought from dime stores, made of thin fabric with bright designs, and paired with plastic masks, held by elastic bands that pinched behind the ears. Others wore homemade creations pieced together from whatever could be found around the house. Bedsheets turned into ghosts, old hats and coats transformed into pirates or hobos. Children carried pillowcases or plastic pumpkins for candy, and they raced in groups from house to house, shouting "trick or treat" with voices full of energy. The streets were alive with laughter and the shuffle of sneakers against sidewalks, while jack-o'-lanterns flickered on porches, their carved faces grinning in the dark. Neighbors handed out candy corn, chocolate bars, popcorn balls, and sometimes apples wrapped in wax paper. Parents often walked behind younger children, their breath visible in the cool air, while older kids roamed freely, determined to fill their bags before curfew. The night ended with candy dumped across living room floors, trades being made, and favorite pieces tucked away to last for days. For many, Halloween in 1972 was both simple and thrilling, a time when imagination ruled the night and the entire community seemed to join in the spirit. Looking back, it was not about elaborate decorations or costly costumes, but about the shared joy of dressing up, running through the chilly evening, and returning home with the sweet spoils of the night. Thanksgiving in 1972 was a holiday rooted in family tradition, with kitchens filled from early morning by the sounds and smells of careful preparation. Turkeys roasted slowly in ovens, their aroma drifting through the house and mingling with the scent of sage, onions, and butter from stuffing that had been mixed by hand. Cranberry sauce often came straight from a can, sliding out with its ridged shape intact, while mashed potatoes were whipped smooth in big bowls that seemed bottomless to children waiting nearby. Families gathered around long tables, sometimes pulling in extra chairs from the porch or basement to make room for relatives. China that was seldom used appeared on the table alongside everyday glassware, and the meal began with quiet prayers or words of gratitude. Laughter soon followed as stories were shared, children squirmed impatiently, and serving spoons clattered against dishes passed from hand to hand. Pumpkin pies cooled on counters until they were finally sliced and topped with whipped cream, a moment many considered the best part of the day. Outside, football games played on television for those who snuck away from the table, while others joined in backyard games of touch football or simply walked in the crisp autumn air. The holiday was not without work dishes piled high in sinks and leftovers carefully packed into refrigerators, but the effort seemed worth it for the joy of everyone gathered together. Looking back, Thanksgiving in 1972 was about more than food. It was about the reassurance of tradition, the comfort of family, and the reminder that even in a year of change, the simple act of gathering around a table gave people a sense of stability and belonging. Christmas morning in 1972 was a celebration that blended simple traditions with the wide-eyed wonder of children. The tree, often decorated with strings of colored lights, glass ornaments, and tinsel that caught the glow, stood as the centerpiece of the living room. Presents wrapped in bright paper and tied with ribbon were stacked beneath, their corners carefully taped by parents the night before. Children often woke before dawn, whispering in excitement until they were finally allowed to rush into the room. Stockings, sometimes handmade and sometimes simple store-bought ones, bulged with candy canes, small toys, and fruit. The air carried the smell of pine, mixed with the aroma of coffee brewing in the kitchen, where mothers and fathers watched with tired smiles as wrapping paper was torn apart in bursts of joy. Popular gifts of the time included board games, dolls, toy cars, and records, while older children might receive a sweater, a camera, or a watch. After the frenzy of unwrapping, the morning often slowed as new toys were tested, batteries were hunted down, and discarded paper was gathered into piles. Families sometimes attended church services, their voices lifted in carols, before returning home to dinners that echoed Thanksgiving in size and effort. The day ended with quiet moments, lights glowing softly on the tree, the sound of music or holiday specials on television, and the warm closeness of family togetherness. Looking back, Christmas in 1972 was less about abundance and more about the feeling of joy it created, a reminder that the season's magic lived not only in gifts, but in the shared spirit of wonder that filled homes on that cold December day. Winter chores in 1972 were part of the season's rhythm, often beginning before sunrise and stretching long after the sun had disappeared behind gray skies. Snow had to be shoveled from sidewalks and driveways by hand, with metal or wooden shovels scraping against concrete in slow, steady movements. Children were expected to help, bundled in layers of sweaters, scarves, and mittens that never quite kept out the damp chill. Ice was chipped from windshields using metal scrapers, breath fogging the glass as parents worked quickly before the morning commute. Salt or sand was scattered on porches and steps to prevent slipping, and boots were left to dry on newspaper-lined floors by the front door. Firewood was stacked neatly beside back doors or in sheds, carried in by the armload to feed living room stoves or basement furnaces that kept homes warm through the coldest months. Inside, drafty windows were sealed with plastic, and extra blankets were folded at the foot of every bed. Though the work could be tiring and the cold unforgiving, there was a quiet satisfaction in completing each task. Neighbors often helped one another, clearing walks without being asked, sharing snow shovels, or knocking on doors to check on older residents. Winter was not something to escape, it was something to prepare for, endure, and meet with patience. Looking back, these small chores taught resilience and responsibility. They also brought a sense of pride, knowing that through effort and care, families could keep the cold at bay and make their homes a place of warmth amid the snow-covered stillness outside. The smell of school books in 1972 is a memory that lingers long after the lessons themselves have faded. New textbooks issued at the beginning of the year gave off the scent of fresh ink and stiff paper, their covers bearing the school's stamp and the names of previous students neatly penciled on the inside cover. Some books were well worn, their pages dog-eared or annotated with faint pencil marks, while others felt crisp, untouched, and full of promise. Children carried them stacked high, tucked under arms or nestled into leather or canvas satchels that creaked under the weight. Composition notebooks with marbled covers, lined paper, and wooden pencils gave every subject a physical presence, from spelling lists to arithmetic tables. Chalk dust hung in the air, clinging to sweaters and fingertips, and the clack of erasers being cleaned outside between classes echoed like a heartbeat through the day. Teachers handed out worksheets from mimeograph machines, their purple ink smudging fingers and releasing a scent that many students secretly liked. The library was a quieter world within the school, its shelves lined with hardcovers, encyclopedias, and dog-eared paperbacks that invited exploration. Dictionaries were kept on stands, too heavy to carry around, and globes spun slowly on wooden pedestals in classrooms, pointing students toward distant places they had only read about. Learning was tactile, marked by the turning of pages, the tapping of pencil erasers, and the weight of books carried home in the late afternoon light. Looking back, those school materials were more than just tools. They were symbols of effort, curiosity, and the steady path of growing up objects that marked a child's place in the world, one subject at a time. Record stores in 1972 held a special kind of magic, especially for teenagers searching for their next favorite album or single. Stepping inside meant entering a world of sound, even before a single note was played. The walls were lined with shelves of vinyl records, their colorful covers displayed like artwork, each one hinting at the stories held in its grooves. Bins were sorted by artist or genre, and the soft flick of fingers flipping through sleeves was a constant background noise. Stores often had a turntable near the counter, where staff played new releases or took requests, the music filling the space and drawing nods of approval from customers browsing nearby. Teenagers saved up for weeks just to walk in and buy one album carefully chosen, carried home like treasure, and played over and over again until every lyric was memorized. The experience was personal and deliberate. Reading the liner notes, admiring the artwork, and feeling the weight of the vinyl in hand made listening to music a full ritual. Some record stores had posters tacked on the walls, advertising upcoming concerts or promoting new bands that were just beginning to catch on. Friends often went together, debating which artists were overrated and which B-sides were better than the hits. The people who worked there were usually music lovers themselves, quick to recommend something unexpected or share a behind-the-scenes story. Looking back, record stores in 1972 weren't just about buying music, they were places of discovery, connection, and identity. They gave young people the tools to shape their own tastes, one album at a time, and to carry the soundtrack of their lives home under one arm. Soda pop in 1972 came in glass bottles that felt cool and heavy in the hand, with metal caps that snapped off with a hiss, sending a wisp of fizz into the air. Each bottle was a little reward, a pause in the day, whether pulled from a vending machine at the corner store or chilled in a cooler filled with ice behind the counter of a small gas station. Flavors like cola, root beer, orange, and lemon lime were the most common, though regional varieties added to the excitement. Some bottles required a bottle opener, and most were returned for a few cents, deposit a small but meaningful exchange for children hoping to buy a treat. Collecting and returning empty bottles became its own ritual, with kids pulling red wagons or riding bikes with crates strapped to the back, rattling with glass as they headed to the store. The soda cooler was often a chest-style refrigerator with a sliding lid, and reaching into the icy water to grab a bottle brought a moment of pleasure before the cap was even removed. Drinking straight from the bottle was the norm, the glass cold against the lips and the fizz tickling the nose. For many, soda was a treat saved for weekends, picnics, or family gatherings. It appeared at birthday parties, on fishing trips, and during summer afternoons when the heat called for something sweet and cold. Looking back, those glass bottles weren't just about the drink itself, they were part of a larger ritual of refreshment, delight, and nostalgia. They marked a time when even small pleasures were savored slowly, and when a single bottle of soda felt like a reward that made the whole day a little brighter. Chores before supper were part of the daily rhythm in 1972. A quiet agreement that the house had to be tended before anyone could sit down at the table. Children were expected to pitch in, and the work was rarely up for debate. One child might be tasked with setting the table, carefully unfolding cloth napkins, and placing forks and knives in the proper order, while another fed the dog or gathered laundry from the line outside before the evening dew settled in. Leaves were raked in the fall, carried to the curb in burlap sacks, and snow was shoveled in the winter so paths were clear when Dad pulled into the driveway. Inside, counters were wiped, toys picked up, and wood brought in, if the house still relied on a stove for heat. Sometimes the chores were small, like watering houseplants or dusting shelves, but they mattered. Mothers often worked in the kitchen with a quiet focus, the smell of onions sizzling in a pan or bread warming in the oven signaling that supper was nearly ready. Radios played softly, and the clinking of pots and pans blended with the creak of floorboards as children rushed to finish their tasks before being called in. There was a sense of shared effort, not because it was glamorous, but because it was expected. Parents didn't usually hand out praise for finishing chores, but they noticed. Looking back, those small acts of responsibility taught more than cleanliness or routine. They taught respect for shared spaces, care for one another, and the value of doing something simply because it needed to be done. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here. Subscribe. Campfire nights in 1972 were some of the simplest and most treasured gatherings, whether in backyards, campgrounds, or quiet corners of state parks. The fire itself was always the centerpiece, built from carefully stacked logs and kindling, its flickering light casting long shadows and warming cold hands. Children crouched nearby with long sticks, marshmallows speared and slowly turning golden over the flames, though many wound up charred black and eaten anyway with laughter and sticky fingers. Older kids told ghost stories in hushed voices, their faces lit from below by flashlights, each tale trying to outdo the last. Parents leaned back in folding chairs, sipping coffee or soda, their conversations low and easy under the stars. Sometimes a guitar would appear, and familiar songs carried through the air, voices rising in chorus. Sparks drifted up into the dark sky, where constellations seemed closer than they did from porch steps or city streets. Coolers were stocked with snacks, and the smoky smell clung to clothes and hair long after the fire had faded to glowing embers. There was no need for watches or schedules, time moved at its own pace, measured by the crackle of wood and the rhythm of shared stories. Looking back, those evenings weren't about where you were or what you had, but about who you were with and how the world seemed to pause around the firelight. Campfire nights reminded families and friends that connection didn't need anything fancy, just a little warmth, something to roast, and the comfort of being together under an open sky. A first job interview in 1972 was a moment that marked the quiet crossing from adolescence into young adulthood. It usually came with a mixture of nerves and pride, hair combed neatly, best shirt ironed the night before, and shoes polished until they almost shone. The places hiring were often local: a grocery store, diner, gas station, or small department store downtown. Teenagers stepped inside, heart pounding just a little faster, holding a paper application filled out in their own handwriting. The manager, sometimes a neighbor or a friend of the family, would ask questions in a quiet back office or while wiping down a counter. The tone was serious but kind, and the expectations were clear: be on time, work hard, and be respectful. No resume, no emails, no formal rescheduling. You got a call back or you didn't. And if you did, it felt like the start of something big. That first job might involve bagging groceries, bussing tables, answering phones, or folding clothes. But the paycheck felt like proof of responsibility. Friends would gather afterward to ask how it went, offering congratulations or teasing if the answers got fumbled. Parents offered advice before and after, sometimes pretending to be less nervous than they really were. Looking back, it wasn't just the interview that mattered. It was what it represented. A sense of standing up a little straighter, being trusted, being seen. That small moment of walking through the door and shaking someone's hand meant more than the task itself. It meant you were stepping out into the world, beginning the long process of becoming who you were going to be. Riding the school bus in 1972 was a daily ritual that carried its own quiet drama, routine, and sense of community. The buses were often loud, a little dusty, and smelled faintly of vinyl seats warmed by the sun. Mornings began with the groan of brakes and the familiar hum of the engine pulling up to each corner. Children waited in clusters at the end of driveways, book bags slung over shoulders, breath visible on cold mornings, or hair sticking to damp foreheads in the late spring. The bus driver usually knew everyone by name and kept order with a firm voice and a glance in the wide mirror overhead. The seats near the front were for the younger ones, sleepy and clutching lunchboxes, while the back was reserved for older kids' territory, where jokes were told, secrets were whispered, and the occasional scuffle broke out. The ride itself could be short or long, winding through neighborhoods or country roads, bumping along while kids looked out the window, daydreaming, counting cows or watching the frost creep across the glass. Afternoons were rowdier, with chatter rising as backpacks bounced and students recounted the events of the day. Sometimes the radio played softly up front, tuned to a local station, though most of the noise came from the students themselves. There were friendships formed on those rides, quiet crushes, and rivalries that flared and faded between stops. Looking back, the school bus was more than just transportation. It was a small, moving world where childhood unfolded day by day, where the same yellow frame carried laughter, boredom, anxiety, and comfort all in a single route. Spring floods were a familiar part of life in many towns in 1972, especially when the winter snow melted too quickly and the rain came heavy and fast. The ground, still thawing from months of deep freeze, couldn't absorb the water fast enough, and it ran along curbs and through backyards, turning lawns into shallow lakes and dirt roads into sticky tracks of mud. Children, thrilled by the chaos, pulled on rubber boots and sloshed through the puddles, testing the depth and daring one another to go further. Ditches overflowed, and sometimes small creeks became rushing streams overnight. Parents moved quickly, checking basements for leaks, stacking belongings off the floor, and listening to weather reports on the radio for any sign of rising riverbanks. Sandbags appeared where they hadn't been the day before, lined up like little walls against garage doors and cellar windows. The air smelled of wet earth and damp grass, and even indoors, the scent seemed to linger in the corners of houses. Roads were closed without warning, and detours stretched across unfamiliar streets. But despite the mess and inconvenience, there was a kind of neighborly spirit that rose with the water. People helped each other dig trenches, bail water, and carry soaked rugs out into the sun. Children learned quickly what could float. And makeshift boats, old buckets, sleds, or lunch trays were launched across flooded driveways. Looking back, those muddy, dripping days were filled with both worry and wonder. Spring floods reminded everyone of nature's unpredictability, but also of how quickly a community could rally. Rolling up sleeves, sharing tools, and waiting together for the ground to dry once more. Graduation day in 1972 was a moment both joyful and uncertain, the closing of one chapter and the first step into whatever came next. The gymnasium or football field was transformed with folding chairs, banners, and a stage set with a podium that squeaked every time the microphone adjusted. Families gathered early, holding programs and craning their necks to spot their children as they filed in wearing gowns that didn't always fit and caps that never sat quite right. Cameras clicked, some still using flashbulbs, while grandparents beamed and younger siblings fidgeted in their seats. The ceremony itself was simple: an opening speech, a few tearful valedictorian words, and the slow procession of names being called one by one. Each student stepped forward, shook hands, and received a diploma that felt heavier than the paper it was printed on. Friends nudged one another in line, shared inside jokes, and held back tears when hugs came afterward. Some already had jobs lined up or plans for college. Others were unsure, standing at the edge of a future that felt both wide open and strangely distant. Afterward, families gathered for cake and photos in backyards, and the graduates traded their caps for denim jackets and plans for the evening bonfires, bowling alleys, or late-night drives through town. Looking back, graduation wasn't only about the ceremony. It was about the quiet realization that something had ended, something familiar and routine, and that everything ahead would be different. But in that moment, surrounded by friends and family, there was still time to linger, to laugh, and to feel proud of the road already traveled. Every home in 1972 seemed to have one kitchen drawer that held the quiet chaos of family life. It wasn't organized, not really. But everyone knew what was in there, or at least believed they did. Inside were rubber bands, old receipts, a half-used book of stamps, twist ties, paper clips, and the occasional pencil that had been sharpened down to a stub. There might be stray birthday candles, a matchbook from a long-forgotten restaurant, a ball of string, or a takeout menu folded just so. Safety pins clung to fabric scraps, and pennies spilled from the corners like they had multiplied overnight. Scissors with sticky blades sat atop a pile of clipped coupons. many already expired, while pads of paper waited for grocery lists that might never be written. Children rummaged through the drawer in search of tape for school projects or a working pen, and mothers often muttered as they dug for a battery or a thumbtack. The drawer never closed perfectly, always catching on something just beneath the surface, but that was part of its charm. It wasn't tidy, but it was familiar, like a reflection of the household itself, a little worn, always useful, and filled with the kinds of things no one ever thought to throw away. Looking back, the kitchen drawer was a strange sort of time capsule. It held the small fragments of everyday life, forgotten tools, odd pieces, tiny memories all gathered together in one place. And in that cluttered little space, there was something oddly comforting, a reminder that even disorder could carry the warmth of home. Watching late-night television in 1972 felt like peeking into a quieter, weirder version of the world, long after most of the house had gone to sleep. The living room was dim, maybe lit only by the soft flicker of the screen, and the sound was turned down just enough to keep from waking anyone else. For teenagers, insomniacs, or curious minds, this was when the strange magic happened. The regular primetime shows had ended, and what followed was a mix of reruns, B-movies, local news sign-offs, or eerie public service announcements. Horror hosts introduced creature features with campy jokes and fog machines, while old variety shows replayed in grainy black and white. Sometimes you'd stumble onto a documentary about space exploration or a rerun of an old western, with horses galloping across empty landscapes under dusty skies. Commercials were fewer and odder ads for car dealerships, miracle vitamins, or time-saving gadgets that promised to revolutionize dinner. Around midnight, the national anthem might play, followed by a test pattern and silence. Or sometimes a talk show would carry on into the early morning hours, the host trading slow banter with guests who looked just as sleepy as the viewers. People watching at that hour felt like part of a secret club, connected not by topic, but by time. It was a liminal space, strange and calm, where the rules of daytime didn't apply, and your thoughts had more room to drift. Looking back, those quiet hours weren't just about entertainment. They were about solitude, curiosity, and the odd comfort of knowing that somewhere out there, someone else was probably watching too. The sound of screen doors slamming in 1972 was part of the background music of everyday life. A sharp clap that echoed down sidewalks and across quiet yards. These doors, often made of wood frames and metal mesh, were a fixture of front porches and back entries, letting in the breeze but keeping out the bugs. They creaked when they opened and snapped shut with a spring-loaded finality that everyone recognized. Kids burst through them in a rush, racing outside with barely a word, or came back in muddy and flushed from play, letting the door bang behind them as mothers called after them to slow down or wipe their feet. The sound itself wasn't annoying back then, it was just part of the rhythm of the day, like birdsong or the hum of a neighbor's mower. On summer evenings, the door might be propped open to let in the cool air, while the smell of dinner drifted through the house. A fly swatter always hung nearby, just in case something snuck in. These doors weren't fancy, and they didn't always close right. Some were patched with tape, others had loose springs or bent frames, but they worked. And they symbolized something: movement, freedom, the easy flow between indoors and out. You didn't knock on a screen door if you were family or a friend. You called out, or just stepped in, and the screen door marked that moment of familiarity. Looking back, it wasn't the door itself that mattered. It was the way it stood between two worlds, private and public, home and neighborhood, and how easily it swung to let life pass through. Gas stations in 1972 were more than just places to fuel up. They were small hubs of conversation, service, and the occasional neighborhood gossip. Most were full service, which meant you didn't even have to leave your car. A uniformed attendant, often with a name stitched into his shirt, would jog out with a smile, lift the heavy metal nozzle, and ask, "Fill her up?" While the gas pumped, he'd clean your windshield with a squeegee and check your oil with practiced ease, sometimes adding a quart if needed. You could buy a cold soda from the machine out front, or grab a pack of gum or a map from the small counter inside. There were paper towels near the pump, a rack of air fresheners by the register, and a dinging bell that rang each time a car pulled over the hose near the entrance. People paid in cash or wrote checks, and the prices were low enough that a few dollars could get you through the week. On long trips, families planned their bathroom breaks around gas stations, which usually had a single restroom with a key attached to a giant wooden paddle or hubcap. Mechanics worked out back, grease on their hands and radios playing through open garage doors. And locals often knew who could fix a carburetor best, or who might trade labor for parts. Looking back, stopping at a gas station wasn't just about the fuel. It was a small pause in the day, a place to catch your breath, chat with someone friendly, and maybe even get directions scribbled on a napkin. The final day of summer in 1972 didn't arrive with fireworks or fanfare. It slipped in gently, with cooler evenings, earlier sunsets, and the faint smell of dry leaves on the breeze. There was a softness to the light, a golden slant that reminded you the long days were coming to a close. Kids tried to squeeze out one last bike ride, one last game of hide and seek before dinner. You could hear them calling to each other across yards, their voices already tinged with the knowledge that school would start again soon. Lawn chairs were folded and stored, grills scrubbed one last time, and the patio lights that had glowed every evening began to stay dark. Mothers switched from lemonade to warm cider, and catalogs with school clothes and lunch boxes began appearing on the kitchen table. Radio DJs started playing fewer beach songs and more soft rock, songs that matched the bittersweet feeling in the air. The last day of summer wasn't on any calendar, it was something you felt. Maybe it came the moment you pulled out a sweater for the first time in months. Or when you noticed the cicadas had gone quiet. In 1972, people didn't chase the season to its end. They let it fade, gracefully, like the final pages of a good book. Looking back, that final day of summer was never really sad. It was reflective, even a little hopeful, because even as the warmth faded and the daylight shortened, there was the comfort of routine ahead, and the quiet promise that summer, just like memory, would return again in its own time.